Hi everyone, this is Andrei. I am the CEO of AtlasIntel, and I am very happy to introduce to you today to a new edition of Atlas Deep Dive US. Joining me, Pedro Azevedo, our head of US research, and today we are releasing our so much awaited swing state polls for the US election. This is really the moment of the truth when we find out what we believe, according to our numbers, the current equilibrium in the Electoral College is. And it is quite an equilibrium. I'm not going to, make you wait for for the results state by state. So let's look at this map. We will be talking about North Carolina. We will be talking about Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. These are the states that we're currently considering to be the true swing states of this election. I am a bit in doubt about Minnesota, actually. I'm also a bit in doubt about Virginia. I think they're still lean Democrat, but I think that in our next round of swing state polls, we should probably include them. For now, we're just going to adhere to the current consensus that they are indeed lean Democrat. And we will be talking about each of the states that I just mentioned. And looking at this map, there are some things that are perhaps not that surprising and some things that are actually quite surprising. And I would say the first surprise, let's talk about the first surprise at the national level. In our last poll, you had seen an advantage of 3 points for Trump.
Yep, national advantage of 3 points.
We had another scenario that was actually even higher in the head-to-head, but in the full scenario, it was 3 points. Based on a 3 percentage point advantage, you would expect that this map would look better for Republicans in this cycle. So this is a first surprise. Large national advantage when it comes to our poll that doesn't translate into a bad map for Republicans, but it translates into a more challenging map than what you would expect.
Yeah, I was hoping, in fact, that we could maybe open with that because exactly like you said, this map isn't what you would expect at first glance when we just had a poll that had Trump up by 3 points at the national level. So I wanted to actually start by asking you, Andrei, do you think that in the few weeks since we conducted our national poll, has there been some sort of realignment, or do we think that's still the scenario at the national level, and there is some sort of demographic shift here that explains this map, even though Trump is still a few points ahead?
We don't. We have our tracking poll, which is both internal and shared with our subscribers, mostly financial market subscribers, and that looks at numbers that are stable. We still have Trump ahead by that margin, more or less. I mean, there's some volatility within those numbers, but at the national level, actually, the volatility is very small, and Trump is still ahead by a considerable margin. One that you would expect would translate into a map that would look better than this. Yeah. So that's not it. It didn't change. It didn't change since we last published. It's not the case that Kamala improved at the national level in terms of the national popular vote. What is the case, though, is perhaps something similar to what happened in the midterms. The red wave that was so widely expected didn't really take place as you'd expect. So you actually had the red swing of 3.5 more or less. Oh, actually, no, it was a bit less, 2.8, right?
Yes.
Percentage points for Republicans in the last midterms. But when you look at seats that actually mattered for Republicans, it didn't really make a difference. And
the Democrats kept the Senate. The Republicans got a very small margin in the House. It didn't really...
So why does that happen? It's all about some idiosyncrasies. And it really matters, and this is also why we're going to look at every state. So based on a national advantage of 3 points for Trump, you would not expect North Carolina in blue on this map, right? I think North Carolina is perhaps the biggest surprise here. And it is really, given the fact that the numbers are so tight, the fact that you have 16 electoral seats in North Carolina that right now are colored in blue, that explains most of what we see in the 248, 253 balance. If we were to remove 16 seats from Democrats on this map, give them to Republicans, as you would whenever you think of the national advantage of 3 percentage points for Trump, it's it solves most of the conundrum.
Yeah.
And then we have 3 states that we're still coloring as toss-ups, right? Georgia, Arizona, and Wisconsin, and we're going to talk about each of them. I think in the case of Georgia and Arizona, it's mostly about generational shifts in the electorate. Georgia in particular, I would say that's the case. I think in Arizona, you also have the impact of a Senate race that actually anchors the scenario in a better way for Democrats than for Republicans. In both, actually, in all of Georgia, Arizona, and Wisconsin, we're going to see Trump is slightly ahead, but less than 2 percentage points ahead. And the margin of error for these polls is 3 percentage points. If you're saying that Trump is ahead by 1 point, and in some cases by less than 1, essentially we're not saying that is an advantage that you can really rely on. So that explains our decision to color the map this way.
Yeah, we should probably reinstate again that, like you said, within our margin of error, this is still going to be a very close race, right? Both the states where Trump was ahead and the states where Kamala is ahead, those are still very small margins. So this is still, this is going to be a tight race.
I would still say, that according to this map, we still have a Trump advantage.
Oh, definitely.
In terms of analyzing that, for a few reasons. First, look at Pennsylvania. There's anything that really matters, and that's actually a difference between what our poll shows and other polls show. So the New York Times poll, the New York Times Siena poll, that also was kind of different from the average in terms of showing Trump way better in the national popular vote. They had a very good poll for Kamala in Pennsylvania, and that's not our case. So that's the first good news for Trump. In a map that looks worse than you'd expect, having Pennsylvania colored in red is a really good news for him. Second good news, we have 3 states that are colored as toss-ups. There is a numerical advantage in each of them. That also matters. I mean, it is a statistical tie, but when he's systematically ahead, even by small margins, kind of accumulates into a higher probability of winning one of these states, right? And I think the third good news is that, North Carolina is colored in blue, but perhaps the Republicans can pull their act together and figure out what to do about that governor race, and maybe that can shift the scenario in North Carolina. So still, you have a very tight race. I agree. Structurally, I would say that it's still a bit better for Trump than for Kamala. It does bring into question my percentages, 70-30. But before we analyze those percentages, let's look at the state by state numbers. So
yes,
let's start with North Carolina. This is a poll that had 1,173 respondents between the 20th and the 25th of September. We have a likely voter concept for it. So the demographics are quite correlated with what we had in the last election and exit polls. But because we're looking at a likely voter concept and because we modeled that independently, there are some differences. that are quite technical. I'm not going to get into them. Let's look at the numbers, right? Kamala Harris, 50.8%, Trump, 47.3%, Jill Stein, 0.9%, Cornel West, 0.6%, Chase Oliver, 0.2%. Given that we're looking at likely voters, very few undecideds in this concept of a sample. And when we look into the demographics here, we see something quite interesting in the fact that Trump does quite well among elder voters, 65 plus. This used to be a stronghold for Biden, not so much anymore in this new race. Kamala dominates the younger segment up to 29, and we're going to see states where disadvantage is actually much greater. There is a clear divide in terms of the racial dynamics, what you'd expect. Only 11% of black voters in North Carolina declaring a vote for Trump. And then also quite interesting, in the crosstabs, you see 7.4% of voters for Trump in the past election declare a vote for Kamala Harris. 5% of voters that chose Joe Biden in 2020 declare a vote for Trump. So it's quite balanced. But then when you look at those that didn't vote, they tend to be younger. 2/3 go for Kamala. So something very clear here, I would say.
I'd also point out, Andrei, about the demographics that Kamala is performing, she still loses to Trump among white voters, but she's performing a lot better here, and we'll also see in Georgia, I think, with white voters than in the northern Rust Belt states.
Yeah.
And that would be mostly, I think, because of I think these are young white voters, right? These are, the variable here is exactly like you said, that they are young voters, that these are the new voters that are coming in, and these are coming in especially for Kamala. So like you said earlier, it's sort of maybe a generational shift we're seeing here, where these younger voters in North Carolina are coming in and helping, push that over the line for the Democrats.
Yeah, so there's one clear thing that impacts North Carolina, perhaps more than other states, and that is the young wave. Kamala really shifted the race. Mm-hmm. This is not a segment that was excited at all about Biden. It may actually be the case that some older voters are now shifting to Trump, so that it compensates a bit for whatever Kamala is winning among the younger voters. But it's very obvious that young voters are very excited for Kamala, and in particular in some of the states that we're talking about today. And North Carolina really stands out. This is not what we would have expected in terms of the balance. So let me ask you, Pedro, why? Why is this happening in North Carolina?
Well, like we see here, I think it has a lot to do with the gubernatorial election. I mean, in addition to the young wave, like we're talking about right now, the Republicans have been, struggling maybe with their candidate for governor in the state. Mark Robinson, who is the current lieutenant governor of North Carolina, he was already seen as perhaps an extreme candidate among Republicans in the primary, but he was, this is a problem that Republicans often have with this sort of
the primary
the
dynamics, and
the primary dynamics right now are really favorable to some more extreme candidates, to the base that that likes Trump, and candidates.
Let's call it radical, not extreme.
Oh yeah, okay. It's more favorable to radical candidates, to candidates that have that engage in more controversial, let's say, discussions, and that engage, have that Trump-like style.
That this is the least concerning issue for Mark Robinson right now. Though.
Well, Well, yeah, exactly. But the thing is, he was already trailing Josh Stein, and then came, what we're talking about now. That is the scandal. The CNN reported a few weeks ago.
Can you explain to me? I mean, it's very clear based on these numbers: 54% vote intention for Josh Stein, 37% for Mark Robinson, in a state that is supposed to be a competitive state in the presidential election. Actually, it's supposed to be a lean Republican state in the presidential election. Why in the world is Mark Robinson still in this race when it's the toll on the presidential race is so obvious? Why is he still in this race?
Well, you'd have to ask him that because many Republicans have been saying that he should drop out after the scandal that CNN reported recently, where comments were found in explicit websites from before he was lieutenant governor, but where he is espousing some pretty intense views regarding slavery and regarding other sensitive topics. Many Republicans had been calling for him to drop out, but he didn't want to. He feels like he should remain in the race, and right now he has we have gone past the deadline this week, I think, where he could take his name off the ballot, and the Republicans could maybe replace him for someone else. So now they're stuck with this guy, and with this guy who has, like we see here, who has a massive gap behind Josh Stein, and who could, like we're saying here, who could be holding the Republicans back, including holding Trump back in this state.
What happens if he drops out after the deadline?
Well, if he drops out after the deadline, the Republicans can't replace him. Basically, right now, the ballot will still have his name on it.
Election?
And, yeah. It will still be Josh Stein against Mark Robinson in the ballot. He'll just not campaign anymore. So that's, now that they're stuck with him, basically, he's got to stay in and keep campaigning essentially, because exactly, the alternative is basically a non-contested election. It's just handed over to Josh Stein.
Yeah. So this is really difficult to understand from my perspective. The scandal is there. You can talk all you want about New York Times and its editorial agenda, and perhaps that it's becoming more and more biased or left-leaning as time passes by. But it's not a made-up story. The New York Times story is not a made-up story.
It's a CNN story.
Oh, it's a CNN story?
Yeah.
You're right, CNN. My comments still stand. You can talk all you want about CNN and their bias, but it's not something that they would just made up, right?
Mm-hmm. The comments are there. People have seen them. So, yeah.
And it's very hard to explain. How would you have, technically, how would someone have hacked his email address so that, he would have been posting all of these comments? It's just very hard to believe that he's innocent. And this is taking a toll on Republicans in North Carolina, and this may cost them the presidential race in North Carolina, according to our numbers. And just looking at the numbers, we'll see states like Pennsylvania, where the news are great for Trump, Michigan, Wisconsin, many states where other polls show the Democrats ahead. Mm-hmm. This is a huge surprise for me. And
like you said, in the electoral map, if they held on to North Carolina and the other results we have were the same,
that would be the election, national
right?
advantage of 3 percentage points, and it would be pretty much calling the election for Trump.
Yeah,
so
with our results right now, with Georgia, Arizona, and Wisconsin as toss-ups, they're at 253 votes. With North Carolina on their corner, they would be at 269, so just one shy of 270.
So the Republicans have set themselves up for a huge problem in North Carolina, for sure. And I would even say this is not just a North Carolina problem anymore, because, it's a scandal that's known not even only in the US, it's known worldwide. Everyone's talking about it, and everyone's talking about it in a way that is negative. I mean, why would you stick with such a candidate when you could have such an easy way out? No, we have to say though that we are, recording this on the day that, or actually the day after, the day after the mayor of New York was just indicted on corruption charges. It's the first time in history of a mayor of New York to face such charges, Pedro. I think so. It's certainly unprecedented for a mayor of New York to be indicted. And so,
while in office, that's the kicker there, right?
So, perhaps that will sweeten the situation a little bit. Even in North Carolina, perhaps the Republicans can say, well, look at that other guy in New York. At least ours is not corrupt, maybe. But there's a huge difference between New York and North Carolina. I mean, New York, you can lose lots of vote. That will actually be very heavy in the national vote advantage for Trump. If you lose lots of votes in New York State, that will explain why Trump is ahead at the national level and the popular vote. But the Democrats are not gonna lose New York State, whereas Republicans in a swing state like North Carolina have great chances of losing it right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's an important theory, in fact, like what you just mentioned, that we've been seeing Trump get better numbers with black voters and with Latino voters, but these numbers nationally could, like you said, be perhaps in blue states where we won't feel the difference in the electoral college. And so maybe we have this, that's why there's this different picture, where we're seeing maybe some sort of realignment here in
two of the most criticized administrations that the Democrats have are in large states. California, I mean, look at San Francisco and the crime wave, and it's a national poster card of, bad city politics. And then New York, right? So those are two states that are very heavy in terms of population numbers. Huge voter base for the Democrats. But guess what? In an electoral college system, it doesn't matter. And it would be so odd for this election to result in a popular vote win for Trump and an electoral college loss. Have you thought about how strange that would be?
That would be, that's really, I think most people would not bet on that.
But it doesn't.
From our numbers, right?
It kind of makes sense, though, right? I mean, if you're losing voters in North Carolina and in New York, when you're the Democratic Party, and those are such huge states, I mean, that really explains, I think, a lot about the Siena poll, the New York Times poll, about our poll. We're not looking at an electoral college map that would be compatible with a landslide election in the electoral college based on what you'd see in the national popular vote. And it's because of how the geography of this works. I mean, California and New York, guess what? Doesn't really matter for the electoral college. Let's move to Georgia.
Okay, let's go.
Same period, 20th to the 25th of September, 1,200 respondents. Same concept, very tight result. Trump, 49.3%, Kamala Harris, 49%, Chase Oliver, 0.1%. People in Georgia don't really appear to like Jill Stein or Cornel West, and very few are undecided. If you look at the head-to-head, it's basically identical. And in terms of the demographics here, there's something quite odd in the crosstabs in Georgia with the young voters, 76% for Kamala and only 17% for Trump. And then in the other age groups, in all of them, Trump is ahead. So this is a bit strange, but you shouldn't crosstab dive. So I always advise even myself not to do that. There is a good reason. I mean, the numbers are supposed to be representative at the level of the entire sample. They're not supposed to be representative at the level of crosstabs. We're looking at crosstabs because it's interesting to analyze the tendencies and differences. And you can say based on these crosstabs, there is a young wave in supporting Kamala in the other states.
Yeah, they show us the broader trends, basically, right? We shouldn't focus too much on the specific numbers here, but the broader trends, we can
that's not the
deduce something
the statistical concept behind how this works. Very clear advantage for Trump at the rural level, very clear advantage for Kamala urban, and suburban is essentially a tie. When we look at the vote, the 2020 vote, virtually all Trump voters, 97% say that they're going to still vote for him. 95% of Biden voters say that they're going to vote for Kamala, but you have about 5% of Biden voters shifting to Trump. So these numbers are better for Trump than for Kamala when you look at what happened before, but young voters compensate for this. So those that didn't vote essentially cancel whatever, vote switchers from Biden to Trump from last cycle. They're compensated by the ones that didn't vote, that are generally young. And because in Georgia we have this entire process of registering black voters, that's sort of a huge effort that the Democratic Party has put into Stacey Abrams, right? Over the past 2 decades, it's I would say that it's continuing, perhaps not at the pace that it was relevant before. We're essentially left with a toss-up in Georgia. What do you
all
think,
of that to
Pedro?
say that we are back in 2020, essentially, right? In 2020, Georgia was decided by 0.3 percentage points. And well, like you said, I feel like the tendencies here, they compensate for each other. We're seeing again Kamala lose some of the edge that Biden had with black voters in 2020, but she's again making that up with other demographics. She's doing better in the white vote, and that's maybe perhaps that's probably due to the younger voters, like you said. These new people coming in. And essentially, I feel the numbers say it all. Georgia will be razor thin, and if we go back to the general map, to the Electoral College map, we'll see that basically in the scenario that we have with Wisconsin, Arizona, and Georgia as toss-ups, for the Democrats to win, they would have to essentially win either Arizona or Wisconsin and Georgia. And so essentially this again will be
It's a must-win state.
decisive, and it will be a nail biter again, especially since recently the Georgia Electoral Commission passed the ruling that all the ballots in the state have to be counted by hand. So Georgia will take I think even longer than 2020 to count all their ballots, and we could end up in a situation where
we're still
the
waiting
rest
for
of the
Georgia
race is decided,
2
but
weeks
Georgia
after the
is the
election.
key state, right?
Yeah.
And so we can be in a situation where we're into, a month after the election, we're still waiting for Georgia to define the results.
My expectation about Georgia is that perhaps the scenario is a bit better for Trump than these numbers show. And I would say that based on 2 ideas, maybe like a hunch. Something that perhaps I shouldn't do so much, but when you look at such a tight difference, it's very inviting to figure out if there is a dynamic that could perhaps incline the balance one way or the other. The fact that Kamala does not as great as you'd expect among black voters may mean that they will be less energized than they were for Biden in the last cycle. That was hugely important. And, there was something quite mythical about, the effort to mobilize those voters at the levels that they were mobilized past cycle. perhaps given that already happened once, and perhaps given that already happened once, resulting in a presidency that was not such popular at the end of the day. I mean, the disapproval rating for Biden is considerable, even among black voters. I mean, the majority approve, but not at the levels that they would have expected when they voted for him. This also reflects, I think, negatively on Kamala. And within the black electorate, Kamala inevitably was more on the radar. I mean, they were paying more attention to Kamala because perhaps she was black. So in a sense, the novelty effect for Kamala and the fact that you already had this huge mobilization past cycle that was successful. My expectation is that at the margin, I mean, we're talking about very small differences here, and this is really a toss-up state for sure. But my expectation is that a slightly lower mobilization of black voters in Georgia is quite likely, and that is good news for Trump, and that may mean that Trump will carry Georgia. My other hunch is that among the Republicans and among white voters, it's quite the opposite. At least some in the last cycle could have thought that Georgia was a state that they would win, because Georgia was traditionally red. That's clearly not the case anymore. So if you had any of those voters that would have voted Trump but didn't really think the election was in danger in the state of Georgia, well, guess what? They're going to mobilize now. So based on those two dynamics, I would say that at the margin, my expectation is that Trump should carry Georgia. But these numbers don't offer much comfort, right?
Yeah, no, but definitely it's important, like you said, for us to remember that the Democrats flipping Georgia in 2020 was the result of a massive effort. And again, all that to win Georgia by 0.3%. And so that's a massive effort that would have to take place again for them to have a chance, right? So I agree that the tendency is perhaps more favorable for Republicans here and for Trump especially.
I agree.
Especially since he has become much more popular, I think, with black voters between 2020 and now. So he has that going for him.
I agree. Let's talk about Arizona. In Arizona, 946 respondents, same dates, a 3 percentage point margin of error, and a result that is well within the margin of error. 49.7% for Trump, 48.6% for Kamala Harris, undecideds at 1.1%, Jill Stein 0.4%, summing up blank, null, other 0.3%. So here we're looking at the difference of 1.1 percentage points in favor of Trump in the full scenario. And then when we go to the head-to-head scenario, that increases to 1.2. Very tight, very small advantage for Trump here. Tell me, Pedro, what's your hunch? What is happening in Arizona?
Well, Arizona, like you said, we see Trump a bit ahead, but, we have it classified as a toss-up here. And a lot of that has to do with, I would say, the enthusiasm among Democrats and among Republicans, right? Arizona has something very important here that is, and that I think would not show up necessarily in our numbers because it's not directly related, but could be indirectly related, which is on November they will also have on the ballot an initiative regarding abortion in the state law. And that has been a very powerful mobilization issue for Democrats, right? Enshrining abortion rights in state law. They've even, managed to pull out victories in Kansas, in Ohio, when dealing specifically with abortion legislation. And so I think that could help Democrats with turnout, and people who wouldn't necessarily turn out for Harris because, like we said, people maybe aren't so excited about her or still aren't sure about what she can deliver or what she stands for. These people who maybe will turn out for abortion or potential people that could help Harris get closer here. And I would also point out, again, perhaps on a smaller scale than the scandal with Mark Robinson in North Carolina, but I feel like the Senate race could be hurting Republicans a bit here. They've chosen to...
Let's look at those numbers. Ruben Gallego, 49.8. Carrie Lake, 45.7. Others, summing up almost 5%. So you have Trump ahead by a very tight margin, Carrie Lake behind by a not so tight margin. And what does that tell us? This is very similar to North Carolina, perhaps not on the same scale. I mean, certainly the difference between Gallego and Lake is not the one we see in the governor race in North Carolina, where it's a huge difference, right? But the dynamics, sort of it points to the same thing. This is a state that structurally has more Republicans than Democrats, even by party registration, right? But both North Carolina and Arizona are Republican states with a moderate streak, right? I mean, this is the state of McCain, right? This is the state of Sinema.
Who, in fact, Kamala evoked at the debate, if we remember, right at the end, she was like, "Oh, the great Senator John McCain," and
she
talking
didn't
about
miss
Medicare.
That chance, right?
Yeah, of course, she knew what she was doing.
That was smart. So that begs the question as to, is betting on Carrie Lake again? This is not the first time. Is this helping Republicans or is it hurting them?
Well, we see here Carrie Lake is running. Ruben Gallego is running at almost the same share as Kamala, right? Kamala is at 48.6. Ruben Gallego is doing a point better. He's at 49.8. Carrie Lake is running 4 points behind Donald Trump. She is, I think that says a lot about the enthusiasm that Republicans have for her. And, like you said, they've already tried her once and she was very unsuccessful in a race that should perhaps have been easier for her, right? Running for governor, and now running again after she already has that that loss on her resume. That's gotta leave some
There's
Republicans at least pondering
about her campaign for sure.
Can she deliver?
It's not as bad as North Carolina, but still a problem.
Well,
right?
Yeah, I mean, she doesn't have a scandal like what we're seeing with Mark Robinson. Yeah. She's just unpopular. She's just some Republicans don't like her, and maybe perhaps, like you said, because of this more independent or moderate streak among some Republicans in Arizona. Carrie Lake she has been very committed to claiming, election fraud in 2020 and then in the election where she lost. And she's been very invested in that rhetoric, and that maybe turns some more moderate independents away from her.
And that is really crucial in a state like Arizona. If we're talking here about even Georgia, maybe, but we're talking about Arizona. I mean, you have lots of moderate white voters in Arizona. That's not good. So these are bad news for Republicans, perhaps. I mean, good and bad. Good in the sense that, Trump's ahead, but you look at the Senate race, you could have had a better setup for this. Something that would anchor them more in a more solid
Yeah, but like we were talking,
situation.
I think this is sort of the reverse of what we were talking about in Georgia, where we have essentially a toss-up. And there, I agree with you that Trump is more likely to take Georgia. I think here we have a toss-up and we see Kamala slightly behind. But
That's right.
I would say that Arizona, I would think could lean more to the Democrats here.
Based on the Senate race,
you know, if
yeah.
we go back to the Electoral College math, Georgia 16 votes, Arizona is 11, right? So
I think it depends a lot on how Kamala, I mean, if there's anything that anchors Kamala in a more radical stance going forward. You know, the median voter in Arizona is moderate. So I think that actually has an implication on the presidential race. If the median voter in Arizona perceives Kamala as more radical than Trump, it's very likely that Kamala will lose the election. If they perceive Trump to be more radical than Kamala, it's very likely that he will lose Arizona. So, and that's also very tricky for these candidates, because at the same time that they need to moderate for winning some of these swing states, well, guess what? If they moderate too much, they're not going to mobilize their base.
That's the great dilemma of, well, I was going to say of an election in the United States, but elections anywhere, right? But like we're going to see a little bit later, I think Kamala is trailing in Michigan, for example, and we've talked about that before. Michigan is a place where where there are a lot of younger voters and voters who expected perhaps a more radical or different stance from her regarding the conflict in Gaza, for example. But then if she takes up that more radical stance that could maybe please the voters in Michigan, then maybe she loses the voters in Arizona, right? So it's a constant exercise in trying to, like you said, reach both sides, right? Both energize your base, right? And seem palatable to the more moderate independents.
Let's go to Nevada. And Nevada is perhaps the least interesting or surprising result. This was a sample with 858 respondents, same dates, same margin of error. Have Kamala Harris ahead at 50.6%, Trump at 47.7%, Jill Stein at 1%, undecided at 0.4%, blank, null, won't vote. And remember, these are likely voters, so we're going to have very few of these in a likely voter concept, 0.3. In terms of the demographics here, you know, Kamala doing better among young voters, Trump doing a bit better among older voters. When you look at the vote in 2020, systematically you find this pattern. Trump holds more voters than Kamala holds Biden voters. There you always see a little bit of a shift there. But then in this case, it doesn't really matter because Biden won Nevada, so there's some space there. And also because,
and again, we see the
among young voters
right?
that didn't vote in 2020 and they will vote now for the first time, Kamala has a large advantage, 62 to 33%. So that cancels whatever impact Biden voters that shifted to Trump could have.
It's interesting here that by our own numbers, like this, we've been saying, right, that these advantages sort of cancel each other out. In this case, it's very real because our numbers here are almost exactly the Biden margins in 2020. And I think that really shows that perhaps, like we've been discussing here, like we've been considering, there may be shifts elsewhere in the country that explain that that difference between the national vote and the state votes. Because here we see, you know, a national environment that is Biden won very nationally stable, right? in 2020 by 4.4%. And now our latest poll has Trump ahead by 3. So that's a 7-point national swing. And yet the result in Nevada stays, it's basically the same. I think I think the difference was 2.4 points in 2020. I'm seeing here.
I mean,
and you know, here we have in the head-to-head we have 2.8 for Harris, so a slight increase, but it's basically the same margin.
Remember that Nevada is one of the states where you have a large shift in terms of the racial component. The Latino electorate in Nevada is quite significant. If we look at the sample profile here, 22.2% Hispanics, and this is a segment that's growing fast in the state of Nevada. Trump may be doing better at the margin among Latino voters, but not enough to compensate for how many new Latino voters are added to the electorate in Nevada this year. So this is sort of, I would say, quite predictable. I would not expect Trump to win Nevada in this cycle.
And it's a good also moment to also remind that, you know, these voters, we talk about them in these broad categories to facilitate analysis, of course. But you know, the Latino voters in Nevada and Arizona, for example, are very different from the Latino voters in Florida, for example, right? The voters in Florida are the ones that actually are a big driving force between shifting Florida further to the right and, you know, making it so that it's barely considered a swing state by now. And they're also in Nevada and in Arizona, the voters that are helping, you know, prop the Democrats up. So it's very important to remember here that, you know, again, we have these broad categories that help us analyze the broader trends, but that inside these groups, there is a lot of diversity.
Trump's doing well among Hispanics, even in Nevada, 41%. But as I was saying, it may be the case that the component shift in terms of how large this electorate ends up being more important than whatever shift in terms of what the preferences of this segment are for the final numbers. And we have a Senate race in Nevada. You want to talk about that? It's quite close. Actually, perhaps closer than what you'd expect. It appears that Sam Brown is a more popular Republican candidate than Kari Lake.
Yeah, well, that's not very hard. But yeah, I mean, I feel like here what we're seeing is, again, we're seeing maybe the opposite of the opposite of Arizona, where we had, you know, a candidate that was running very far behind Trump and a candidate that was running sort of, you know, side to side with Kamala.
Seems like Sam Brown is an asset for Trump in Nevada. This is pretty much what I'm understanding here.
Yes,
he's not
definitely.
He doesn't take votes away from Trump. He tends to add some, perhaps not enough.
Yeah, I mean, these differences, again, they happen at the margins, right?
Yeah.
The effect, most typically, you know, the top of the ticket, the presidential race will affect the down ballot more than the down ballot will affect the presidential ticket, except, you know, in extreme cases like Mark Robinson. And, you know, here you could also have the opposite. You know, if Sam Brown was an incredibly popular Republican, maybe he could be, you know, boosting Trump's numbers here, but he's doing okay. He's a good candidate, right? But he's not, you know, the impact.
And with split ticket voting, I mean, my impression always is that split ticket voting takes place more in the election than it takes place in the poll, because that's really your final chance. And it may be the case that Sam Brown actually comes up ahead, even with Trump losing Nevada, as we expect him to do. It may be the case that Sam Brown could be a surprise for the Senate race. Let's look at Wisconsin. And I think in Wisconsin, I mean, we only talked about pretty bad news for Trump so far, and the swing state polls we're releasing today. I mean, not compared to other polls that show him losing in all of them by wide margins. But perhaps worse results than you'd expect for Trump based on our national popular vote sample. And the Rust Belt states, we're going to be looking at lots of good news for Trump. And it gets better and better as we progress from Wisconsin to Michigan to Pennsylvania. So let's start with the slightly good news in Wisconsin, and then we'll go to the really good news in Michigan and then Pennsylvania. So in the state of Wisconsin, according to our numbers, Trump is at 49.6% in the full scenario. Kamala Harris at 48.2%. Chase Oliver at 1%. Jill Stein 0.9%. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is still on the ballot in
Yes.
Wisconsin.
It's one of the states where he couldn't, where he
So
tried to, and they said, "Oh, sorry, the deadline's gone. You're still going to be here."
So that's why we still have him up at 0.2. And then...
And these would be, the protest voters that were not gonna flip for Trump anyway. So
still, this is good news. I mean,
definitely.
So let's look at, if we look at the head-to-head, 49.7 to 48.2, that is a 1.5 difference. It's kind of like, I think we chose 2 percentage points as the difference between a lean Republican and a toss-up on the first map we showed you. First good news here, Robert F. Kennedy is still in the ballot. Virtually doesn't exist at 0.2, so it doesn't really take votes away for Trump. You have Jill Stein at 0.9 and Chase Oliver at 1, and it appears, when we compare the two scenarios, that at the margin, this hurts Kamala a bit more than it hurts Trump, the presence of these other candidates, even with Robert F. Kennedy still in the ballot. So that's the first good news. If we look at the demographics, more good news there, right? You have quite different from other states in the young voters in Wisconsin, 54% for Trump, 45% for Kamala. Remember, we're not supposed to deep dive very deep in the crosstabs based on age in particular, because the segments are smaller, so the margins over here are huge. In particular, in 18 to 29, this is not what necessarily you'd expect that the majority of the young voters in Wisconsin will vote for Trump, but at least it tells you that there is no considerable wave among young voters in Wisconsin for Kamala, and that tells you that Wisconsin is different. It's different from the other swing states, and it is different from the rest of the country. And that shows you that there is anger, right? There is anti-establishment, anti-democrat anger in Wisconsin, and that is great news for Trump. Look at the independents, 56% for Trump, 37% for Kamala. That's really good for Trump. So these, the demographics are better news for Trump than the overall scenario, and that is quite important.
I feel it really highlights, like you said, the difference. We're going to see this in Michigan and in Pennsylvania as well, the difference between, these states in the Rust Belt and the states in the Sun Belt, the states in the South, where these other states, like you said, we were seeing this big surge for Kamala in younger voters. And this is... well, it's absent here, right? We're not going to focus on the specific numbers here in the crosstabs, but the idea is they're at least tied. It's a lot closer than the big advantages we saw for Kamala in those southern states.
There's also another interesting number here. Switchers from Biden to Trump in Wisconsin way above other states, 8%. 90% of Biden voters say they'll still vote for Kamala, but 8% say they changed their mind and now they're going to vote Republican in this cycle. Only 4% of Trump voters switching to Kamala, and then you have an advantage for Kamala among those voters that are young or didn't show up in 2020. But look how interesting. Here you actually have 12 points for Chase Oliver. So there is an option besides the two candidates that some of these voters are turning their head to. That tells you that, even those that aren't necessarily excited about Trump, they're not necessarily going to go to Kamala when you're talking about Wisconsin. That's really good news actually for Trump, given that this is a swing state that is very tight.
It also shows us that Trump should probably be very thankful that RFK dropped out and endorsed him, because this shows exactly these people coming in for a protest vote, and they're going for Chase Oliver. These people, there could even come even more for Robert Kennedy, and could weaken Trump considerably here if we're talking about protest votes that don't really like either of the candidates. These votes that are now possibly going to Trump could have gone to Kennedy if he hadn't dropped out. His name's still on the ballot, but he basically said, "Oh, don't vote for me, vote for Trump."
We have a Senate race here. Tammy Baldwin is ahead, 48.2 at 46 and 46.7 for Eric Hovde. Good news for the Democrats, but given how popular Tammy Baldwin is, right? In Wisconsin, you'd expect better numbers, perhaps.
Yeah, it's a tighter margin than we say. Tammy Baldwin is popular. She's an incumbent senator. We would be expecting this to be perhaps a broader margin. I think Eric Hovde is a strong candidate. He's definitely a very competent candidate, so that explains a lot. Candidate quality in these races matters a bit more. But definitely, I feel like this plays into the idea here that we were talking about of some resentment with the Democrats and maybe a frustration that the Biden administration didn't perhaps give them the results that these people were expecting, which is, I think, a theme we will see repeated in Michigan and in Pennsylvania.
I think Tammy Baldwin perhaps sweetens the situation for Democrats a bit in Wisconsin compared to Michigan and Pennsylvania. So that may be, if we're right, about this, and if Wisconsin is leaning Republican, but at the lower margin, with a lower advantage than in the case of Michigan or Pennsylvania, Tammy Baldwin has great merit for that, I would say, at this point in time.
Yeah, and I mean, like in 2016 and 2020, Wisconsin was also decided by very tight margins, tighter than Michigan and tighter than Pennsylvania. So I think it's, and I think we'll see this trend, I think, in our numbers in Michigan and Pennsylvania as well. But it's just, it's a state where the Democrats have been a bit stronger, even in moments where this resentment against the Democrats has risen up in the Rust Belt. Wisconsin has been a stronger point for them.
For sure. And now we're at Michigan. In the state of Michigan,
that's the bad news for the Democrats.
918 respondents, 3 percentage point margin of error, 20th to 25th, same data collection period. Trump at 50.4%, so he's above 50 numerically. 46.6% for Kamala Harris. Jill Stein at 1.5%. RF Kennedy Jr. at 0.1%. Chase Oliver doesn't score here as he did in Wisconsin. When we look at the head-to-head scenario, 50.6% for Trump, 47.2% for Kamala. So a bit of a wider advantage compared to Wisconsin. And if we look at the demographics, quite good news for Trump, I would say. Same pattern, very competitive in the young voter segment, very different from what you see nationwide. Very different from what you see in the Sunbelt states or even in Georgia. So no wave of young excitement for Kamala Harris in Michigan. When you look at independents, 47 to Trump, 45 to Kamala. So that is quite competitive there. And then when you look at voters that shifted from the 2020 vote to Biden, 8% have shifted to Trump compared to just 3% of Trump voters that have shifted to Kamala Harris. Here, very different from other states among voters that are young and didn't vote before. It's essentially a tie between Trump and Kamala Harris. This points out to something systematically different about the Rust Belt states. So this is not just it appears that it's not just the Michigan phenomenon, not just the Wisconsin phenomenon, not just the Pennsylvania phenomenon. It's the entire region. Why do you think that? What's different about the Rust Belt, Pedro?
Well, it was, back in 2016, it was, these were the big three that shifted for Trump and gave him the election, right? And I think we may be seeing a lot of that again, a lot of this. Again, they shifted very slightly for Biden in 2020, right?
Mm-hmm.
These were very tight margins for the Democrats there. And basically, I think this shows that this feeling of perhaps being left behind and the feeling, what we've been
it feels like
talking
the anger
about.
that was present the first time that Trump won is back.
Yeah, I mean, it was always there, right? And we've had some of these people shifted for the Democrats, and they said, okay, let's go for Biden, and they're maybe feeling now that, oh, this didn't do much for me, right? These are the people that are suffering with,
and that was the main
suffer
problem
with inflation and with the economic troubles, and so I feel like this is very representative of what the Biden administration has struggled with, right, in terms of delivering and in terms of especially struggling with inflation, which also we don't have that
these used to be
graph
deep
here,
blue states that felt betrayed, right?
Yes.
There's a whole, transformation in terms of the politics of the national. I mean, the significance of the Rust Belt, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was so huge for the Democrats. It was part of the machine politics of the Democrats. These were some of the most reliable places for the Democrats, and
the Blue Wall, it was called.
And Trump totally did away with that. I mean, he really pushed some buttons that mattered. The whole anti-China discourse,
mm-hmm.
the whole thing about make America great again. It resonates so much more in a place like Detroit than other places in the U.S. I mean, the whole economic decline in industrial regions in these states, not only industrial regions, but I would say even in rural regions, in the
mm-hmm.
rural poverty in some of these states is quite concerning, right? And guess what? It didn't really get better
mm-hmm.
under Biden. I mean, certainly not at the level that people would have hoped, and certainly not with the level of inflation that this administration has seen. So it does appear to me that, there's within these numbers a perception I have that in the Rust Belt, the anger is back, and that is very good news for Trump.
And I mean, we're seeing that all across, like you said, this isn't just our results in Wisconsin or just our results in Michigan or just our results in Pennsylvania, right? We're seeing that all across the region. And that's, I think, especially in Michigan, that is very concerning for the Democrats. I mean, if I were in Kamala Harris' campaign and I were to see these polls, I would be perhaps more concerned by the results in Michigan than the results in Pennsylvania, for example, because even when they shifted to Trump, if I'm not mistaken, Michigan was still the most democratic of these states, right? It was the state, like you said, it used to be a big stronghold for the Democrats, and it's shifted. Hillary lost it by a very small margin.
Isn't Gretchen
and then
Whitmer
Biden,
supposed to be
among these three states, it was the one that Biden won by the most. And now, to see this big swing for Trump again, that would be very concerning for the Democrats.
And one would have thought
here.
this wasn't really happening anymore because of Gretchen Whitmer, right? Who is still quite popular, my understanding. So do you think that the electorate in Michigan, the voters are kind of differentiating between, I like Gretchen Whitmer as a governor, but I don't really like the Biden administration, and I don't really like Kamala? I think that could be happening.
I feel like that's very likely. It tends to happen a lot with governors. Governors tend to have this more statewide appeal, where they tend to be somewhat more disconnected from the national party, right? Which is why we see, we get a governor, a Republican governor in Massachusetts or a Democratic governor in Kansas. That happens a lot more, governors from Democratic governors in red states or Republican governors in blue states than, these states flipping in presidential elections, or you are electing Democratic senators in red states, which is in fact one of the big issues for Democrats right now, right? We're talking about the Senate elections in the swing states, but we also have two incumbent Democrats running for re-election in red states, and that's the big issue for the Democrats in the Senate, right? Can John Tester in Montana and Sherrod Brown in Ohio keep their seats there? Especially now, if we see that apparently they're not even going to keep their seat in Michigan, that becomes a much bigger problem.
What do we know about Mike Rogers and Eliza Slotkin?
Well, these numbers are actually a bit surprising, and they are, again, like I said, these should be very concerning for the Democrats, because Eliza Slotkin is actually quite popular, and she was expected to be, one of the easier, of this slate of seats that the Democrats are defending this year. This was expected to be one of the sort of most reliable ones, right? She's running for an open seat, which impacts it a bit, right? The incumbent Democrat is retiring, and Eliza Slotkin, who is a congresswoman, is now running for her seat.
Share is
but
huge, right?
it's
that don't know that makes the entire. So I think you have people that like Eliza Slotkin, but they have sort of a bias of not voting Democrat this cycle. This is what this 5.7 don't know number tells me in this graph.
Yeah, exactly.
That is really
very worrying for them, right?
Yeah, for the Democrats. And good news for Trump. Very good news. And the best news.
The big one.
In Pennsylvania, you have a larger sample, 1,775 respondents, margin of error 2 percentage points, so it's less than in the other states. Trump is ahead at 50.6, Kamala Harris at 48%, Chase Oliver 0.4, undecided at 1%. Interestingly, Jill Stein doesn't show up here. And then if we look at the head-to-head, 51 to 48.1, so it's essentially a 2 percentage point margin favoring Trump and the state of Pennsylvania, the single most important swing state.
19 electoral votes. That's a lot.
Particularly when you may lose North Carolina. I
think the Republicans wouldn't mind, if you came to Trump today and you told him, oh, you're going to lose North Carolina, but you're going to pick up Pennsylvania. I think they would make that trade.
Very interesting in terms of the balance in the demographics. You don't really see the huge young wave you see in other states and at the national level again. So this is a pattern all across the Rust Belt. Young voters in these states aren't as excited about Kamala as in other places in the country. Probably the economic context of the Rust Belt states has everything to do with this. And in some of these demographics on race in Pennsylvania, you also see very surprising numbers. I don't expect Trump will get 46% of the black vote, and I don't expect him to get 39% of the Hispanic vote. And there is a margin of error that's large here, but it's very clear that the Democrats have issues mobilizing some of their core constituencies here. And you can also see that in the percentage of Democrats that say that they'll vote for Trump in Pennsylvania at 9%. You see it in the shift from Biden to Trump at 10% compared to just 1% of Trump voters shifting to Kamala Harris. Very similar to Wisconsin, very similar to Michigan. Actually, some tendencies appear to be even stronger here than in those two other states. So overall, I would say this looks terrifyingly well for Trump. And so different from the Siena poll. That is something that I'm actually, I haven't had a chance to understand more about that, but I'm really curious to figure out what is the difference here. So you have, in the context of the Atlas poll and the Siena poll, there are some of the two most similar ones at the national level. They both show Trump way ahead compared to the poll average. And in Pennsylvania, they kind of tell a totally different story. Curious.
Yeah, the Siena poll has Harris 4 points ahead, right?
What do we think about the Senate election? Bob Casey is ahead at 47 compared to David McCormick at 45. It gets even stranger, right? So you have a Democrat ahead in the Senate race, even as Trump is ahead statewide in the presidential race.
Yeah, this is an interesting...
Very confusing.
This is an interesting one because I think it, again, has something to do with candidate quality here. I think Bob Casey Jr. is very popular in Pennsylvania. He's from a traditional sort of political family there. And David McCormick, he kind of has the same problem as Carrie Lake. I mean, Carrie Lake has it a lot worse, she's a lot more unpopular than him. But David McCormick, he challenged Dr. Oz in the primary for the Senate in 2022, and he lost, by a very thin margin, but there's this guy that is he is a businessman, and he's someone that's more moderate, right? So he's not in that sense, and that perhaps that's why he performs better than Carrie Lake, but he has this problem of perhaps not being as perhaps then the opposite problem of Carrie Lake, where he is not as engaging with the Republican base. He's perhaps more attractive to the median voter, but less to the Republican base.
Do you think it has to do with perhaps the fact that he is a businessman in a state that is very worried about, poverty, and perhaps there is no emotional attachment to David McCormick the same way you'd think about Dr. Oz, for example? I don't know, someone who's more of a down-to-earth popular profile.
Yeah, exactly like Dr. Oz, right? Celebrity known for for recurrent appearances on like Oprah and everything. That's the guy from TV. I know him. And David McCormick, exactly. He's maybe the guy
between him and Trump, like in terms of the kind of dynamics that really get voters excited when it comes to Trump. It's totally different when you try to sell McCormick in the same package. Maybe that explains it.
Yeah, and even I think that also explains a bit. I think the figure in Pennsylvania that most resembles that Trump style is actually the other senator from Pennsylvania, John Fetterman, which is exactly he managed to beat Dr. Oz in the general election. So the Republicans had their issues, and the Democrats actually found someone who has that maybe appeal for what the Pennsylvanians are looking for.
All in all, I would say some of the more puzzling numbers are in Pennsylvania, and also some of the more different compared to other polls, and it's the single most important state. So this is something that we're going to pay lots of attention to going forward. So you can expect me to look at this very closely.
Yeah, it's completely, in terms of electoral math, it's complete, like we said, if the margins here are different, right? But if North Carolina shifted to the Republicans, the Republicans would be almost sure to win. If Pennsylvania shifted for the Democrats, then the Democrats would be in a very good position, right? Even losing Michigan and Wisconsin, they'd have other pickup options elsewhere in the map. And I feel like also that's an important, that point that we've made here before, right, in this podcast before, that is why how Kamala is doing, perhaps not as well as people would expect, given the enthusiasm for her in the media, but doing a lot better than Biden would be doing by now. Because, what we've been discussing, in Nevada, in Arizona, and North Carolina, we would not be discussing this if Biden were still the candidate. If you have this kind of poll where Trump is winning, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania against Biden, Biden is done, because he would have, by the end of his candidacy, he had basically no more chance in the Sun Belt, in the South. It was the Rust Belt or nothing, right? So
let's go back to our question on probabilities. Last time you had 60-40 for Kamala, I had 70-40, 70-30 for Trump. We look at this map. Have you changed your perspective?
I feel like maybe we're gonna converge now, right? Because I feel like this electoral college is worse than you expected, and I feel like this isn't
going the direction you were thinking.
Yeah, exactly. Like I said, the last time we were here, right after the debate, I was thinking, Kamala's still in this, but she needs to, make use of this positive coverage post-debate to, really improve her numbers and be able to energize the base and to reach out, consolidate herself, basically.
And it doesn't really happen except for North Carolina. And North Carolina, it's not because of her, it's because of an accident.
So this map doesn't feel like... If you told me like 2 weeks ago, the map's going to look like this when we do the swing states, I would probably have done, so I'll probably shift it more likely to Trump. So I would say, based on this map, it's a 60-40 to Trump. Because we're still close here, but it's definitely, Arizona, we're saying perhaps shifting to Kamala, but we agreed that Georgia would tend more to Trump, and with Pennsylvania and Michigan being red, I wouldn't bet on Wisconsin staying.
It's very rare that we converge on probabilities, and I'll say 60-40 too. So it almost gives me like a fright. But yeah, I think this is a bit worse for Trump than I would have expected, and it has all to do with North Carolina. Okay, so North Carolina has switched in our internal tracker, over the past couple of weeks. It's gotten really bad for Republicans at the point where I'm not really convinced that they can turn it around anymore. It's huge to lose North Carolina, 16 electoral votes. I don't think there's even additional explanation needed for why I'm reducing Trump's chances from 70 to 60, based on what we're seeing in the Electoral College. If we project an impact of losing North Carolina for the Republicans, that's pretty much it. Elsewhere, it's similar to what I would have expected. I would say that perhaps in Georgia and Arizona, Trump is performing worse than what you'd think based on the national level numbers. But he's compensating through Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. So it's pretty much, it's actually perhaps even better for Trump when you'd put everything in a balance, right? But what pretty much cancels this, relative strength in the Rust Belt, that's a larger region compared to a relative weakness in the Sun Belt, that's a smaller region. What cancels this out is North Carolina. So I would say, 60-40 it is for now.
I would point out, beyond, electoral chances here, that we were talking before about how, Georgia can be the decisive state and it can take, more than a month to count all those ballots by hand. So that's going to raise the tension in the United States. So we're definitely going to see, this map shows me there's going to be a lot of tension in the United States after the election. And even more because, if we agree here that, the Democrats are going to could take Arizona and the Republicans could take Wisconsin, then we're going to wait for Georgia to come in to count the votes, right? Mm-hmm. But if somehow, I'm seeing this now, if the Democrats take Arizona and Wisconsin, and the Republicans take Georgia, that's a tie in the Electoral College. And that's a whole other ball of
And we'll park that for next time, folks. We're not going there in this edition of Deep Dive. Thank you, Pedro. This was great.
Thanks,
and thank
Andrei.
you to all of you that
Pleasure.
watched this. We'll be back soon with more news from AtlasIntel on the US election.